Thank you for joining us for SMAX user group. I'm Brandusha Kevorkian, your host. Today we have the topic of the integration engine, and we'll provide you updates with changes in the recent release. So if you're here, you're obviously familiar with the SMAX user group, but just a quick recap. We have three types of sessions: feature spotlight, like the one today, where we do a deep dive into a capability. We have the release readiness, which is usually around the time of new SMAX release, and then office hours, just open sessions for users to ask questions, share feedback, interact with experts. So in case you have issues with computer audio and you'd like to interact with us, there is also the phone option to call, and all that, the information on the screen are also available in the invite when you register for the session. In terms of the agenda, so we'll just go over quickly the latest patch releases, and then I will hand over to Jan and Carl, and they'll give us an update on the integration engine, and then go through a few demos, and then we'll open up for questions. For the patches, nothing new since we last talked 2 weeks ago. So we have patch 5 on 2022-05 release. So with that, just keep in mind, also review the steps to deploy the OMT or containerized and CMS containerized if you have them deployed. And then we also have the patch 6 on the 2021-11 branch. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jan, and he's going to give us an update on what's new with the integration engine.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session to get the latest information about our integration engine. Today, I'm going to briefly introduce which new features we added in the November release for the integration engine. And I will explain the features, but also which new connectors and integrations we added into our system. And then I will hand over to my colleague Carl, and Carl will then give a live demo or a demonstration to you to show some of the features I introduced initially now based on some couple slides. So the first thing I'm want to share with you is basically in our endpoint area, we added an additional authentication type, which is called OAuth2, which then basically now allows you to connect to many third-party products which only support OAuth2 authentications nowadays. So to establish a connection, to get authenticated there, to receive a token, and then of course to use the token to then integrate with those products to get data, to exchange data. This is now available, and it's a huge step forward to broaden up our authentication methods to allow to connect to additional products which only support OAuth2. That's one important feature we have added. Then as a next step, we added a couple of new triggers in the November release. So the first two triggers, business role and workflow, business role and task plan, and run scenario button. Those features have been there from the beginning of the integration engine. But in November release now we added also a listener and a scheduler. And in particular, the listener is quite important because now basically you can call an integration via a simple REST call from any external product you need to. That means you can launch integrations totally independent of SMAX from externally, and you can pass basically any JSON payload you need to pass or your external product is providing, and push it into the integration you are triggering with the listener where you configured your listener for. And then from there, you can pass the JSON content which has been sent to the integration, and then prepare your data and execute required steps to run your integration. So this is now possible for this November release and allows a lot of capabilities, especially from third-party products, so-called webhook. Webhooks can be now used to trigger integrations. Many third-party products allow kind of webhook features. And Carl will give you a demo in a minute to show you an example how this could be leveraged. Another new trigger we added in November release is a scheduler. So now with the scheduler, you can basically implement or run your scenarios, your integrations you build on a scheduled basis. You can execute them based on the standard recurring patterns you know from Outlook and many other products. This is now possible as well. So simply schedule your scenario and then it's executed on the time frames you have set up. So this is quite some important features which helps to manage better the end-to-end flow of an integration. Prior November release, we really lacking those listener scheduler capabilities, which require then the external system or the remote system to send data back right to SMAX. But now with scheduler or listener, you have much better controls to implement an end-to-end integration scenario. Now, we also enhanced our endpoint execution history. In the endpoint, you probably noticed already from either by using integration engine or by listening to previous user group sessions, we basically track all of the roles and tasks the integration engine executed with request details, response details. And now in this release, we enhanced the filtering capabilities. We added pagination support. We can now sort by all the columns to better support you in case of debugging steps are required, that it's easier for you to find failing tasks and then dig into details to better understand in case something went wrong. And then from connector point of view, we all the items here marked with new have been added. So on Micro Focus products, we just added the asset manager connector. But from the connectors we had in place from the beginning, we added additional actions here, like in SMAX, a managed person version 2, which allows you to basically also assign more than one group and more than one role when you create a person. Version 1 only allowed to set one group and one role. Then on Service Manager connector, we allow now to create, update records in Service Manager or invoke an action. So in case you need to establish a case exchange from SMAX, driven by SMAX, orchestrated by SMAX, you can now do that to Service Manager much easier. On Octane, we now support attachments. And Asset Manager is a brand new connector to download records from Asset Manager into SMAX. For external third-party products, we added on Jira a new action to transition an issue. So transition an issue in Jira is a dedicated action where you can move between workflow phases from one workflow to another workflow step. This was missing and that was customer feedback. So we added this action here. And a new connector is so-called Microsoft Graph API. And in this Graph API, we now provide different actions to give you much more capabilities to integrate with MS Teams. You can now trigger private group chats. You can automatically invite team members to the chat directly, all managed from Service Manager, from SMAX, of course. You can send message to channels. Of course, you can subscribe to channels and chats to get the messages back into the SMAX history. With those Graph API, much more options exist now to integrate with MS Teams. The native MS Teams integration, which has been there since a while, also exists. This does not change. So the MS Graph API will just give you additional capabilities in case you need additional functionalities for your MS Teams integration. Other than that, we added a Workday connector at the moment just to get records. That means you can download or pull data from Workday into SMAX, maybe to enrich your person data or add other activities here. We also added the Azure DevOps connector to integrate with Azure DevOps. And this is basically from use case similar than we add for Octane or Jira or Quality Center. You can create work items, update them, share comments, and of course then query those data and update the related SMAX records. The generic connector did not change. This is still the same as before. So that's what I briefly wanted to share with you to give you an introduction what has been added. And now I hand over to Carl to give you a deep dive demo about the listener, scheduler, and then also to share with you a very interesting use cases how you could use our integration engine to just do internal actions against your current SMAX system without going to the remote system. Carl, over to you.
So we're going to demonstrate a few use cases that we've come up with that will use the new features of the integration engine. The first one is going to be using the listener, and where we will have an external system sending data to SMAX. So our use case is that a customer wants to push a ticket from a remote system to SMAX whenever there's an update or creation of a ticket on the remote system. If it's a new ticket, we need the integration to create a new SMAX request. If it's an update to an existing ticket, then the integration engine needs to update a SMAX request that was previously created. So I have a little flow diagram you can see. So I'll outline a few of the things. So the remote system is going to send 4 fields. So the remote system ID, remote system title, description, and a comments field from the remote system to SMAX when it pushes data. The remote system is going to send the data to the listener. In our case, we're just going to use Postman to send the payload of data. The SMAX listener will listen on a URL that I'll explain in a minute. The information is then passed along to the integration engine where the data will be processed for use. It will search through all existing requests looking for a specific value and determine if there is an existing request or if it needs to create a new one. And then you can see if the integration finds the request, it would update it. If it needs to create a new one, then it would create a new one. So when we configure a listener for a scenario, this is what it'll look like. There's a little button you click and you're prompted with a login and password for the user who will connect to SMAX, and you have a token expiration time as well. After you click generate, here is what you will see. In my case, I'm using URL token as my authentication. You can see here this big URL. This is the URL we'll connect to and send our information to. The first thing we're going to look at is our remote system that is sending the information to SMAX, in our use case from Postman. So any integration you use needs to send data in a similar format to what you see here in our Postman example. So notice here, we're sending a post. And then we also have the URL, the webhook URL that we defined a minute ago. We're going to be sending these 4 fields. So you can see we have the remote system ID with the value. So this is the ticket ID from the remote machine. We have the remote system title. We have the remote system description and remote system comment. Also notice you don't authenticate the same way that we would using an EMS REST call. So I'm going to click send. Another thing we notice is that the data is not in the standard JSON format you would see when you do an EMS REST call. Okay, so now that we've sent that, we're going to move to our integration. So here we see an integration named Webhook Demo Integration. I've created a scenario in it named Postman to SMAX integration. And we can see, if I scroll down a little here, we can see the listener information I showed a minute ago. So here's the URL. And this is the URL that we just entered into Postman. If I scroll down a little farther, so here in our irrigation, we can see all of the process logic that I've added. I've named everything so that I can easily see what each thing is doing. Also, when we look at the endpoint history, when the integration or the scenario run, we'll be able to follow what is happening. So the names here correspond to the little block diagram I showed on the PowerPoint a minute ago. So we'll open our first section. Scroll up a little. So the first section I named Prepare Incoming Data from the Remote System. So the purpose of this section of the integration is to handle the incoming data that is being sent from the remote system. So notice the payload data.remotesystem.id or ID value. This is what is being sent from our integration. So if I were to switch back to Postman, we can see this remote system ID. And then here we are looking at our scenario rule. We can see the same thing. So that is where the data is coming from. Just because it's a demo, the remote request for person, I've hard coded that to be the 1015, but we could work out the logic to find the user or change the user, but in this case, we're not going to. And as I scroll down a little more, we can see our retry policy. By default, it's turned off. If we needed to turn it on, we could, but in this case, we're not going to. So we can see our next section, search in SMAX for an existing record with the remote system ID. So this verifies if a record exists, and if the record is found, the record ID is returned. So if I select a existing request, you can see down here that I have defined a field in SMAX named remote system ID, and it has a value in it. So this is where SMAX is going to search all of the fields and try to find this value. And if it does, that means it's going to update the request. But if it doesn't find a request with the existing field, then it's going to create a new request. Back to the scenario. Okay, so in this part of the logic, it's going to use the remote system ID to search through all of the requests in the system looking for the value we are sending from Postman. So if it finds an existing record, then it will add it here to the SMAX ID field. If nothing exists, then the SMAX ID field will be null. So if I scroll down a little, oh, this is the field I mean here. So if the search finds something, it'll populate it, and if not, it'll be null. Now we can scroll down to our next section. So this, you can see that I have defined a condition. So I have an if condition that says that if the SMAX ID is null, that it'll create a new request. If it meets the condition, notice all of the fields that we prepared in our first step. Also notice, if we scroll down a little farther, we can see our payload preview. So everybody recognizes this. This is what the EMS payload would look like. If we scroll down a little further, the next part, we can see I also added an output criteria. So once the request is created, we are going to store the ID of the created request in the created_ID field. I had comments when I sent the data from Postman. So comments are actually handled a little different. It's a different type of rule because it's a different REST call that we'll do. So if you look here, I added this section, add comments, new SMAX request was created. It has our condition, but notice here, the entity ID is our created_ID field that we created before. And then our comment, we can see it was from the first section we defined, receive parameters, remote comment. We clicked on send a minute ago. So if I go to the endpoint and I select our listener example, we can see here all of the various jobs that have run relating to our integration. So in this case, if we come here, this is the starting point. So we recognize this name. This is where it says prepare incoming data from the remote system. So we can see we recognize all these things. Prepare, we have our search. And then if we move up here, we can see our create a new request using the remote system ID. And if we view that, we can actually see data about what the scenario was doing when this particular rule ran. So we can see our the top section, the payload and everything sent to SMAX. And if we get down here, we can see our response, but we can also see our output. So we can see that in this case, it created a request with ID 22972. So if we now move to our 11, we'll move to our request grid. I can click on this. So here's our request. Now we can see that we have our populated remote system ID, which was 867-539. If we go into our discussions, we can now see that the comment was added. And so everything worked successfully. So this was the first use case we had where we were using the listener and the integration engine to create a new request if none existed with that remote system ID. So we're going to go back to our integrations. So our second part of our use case is updating a ticket if the remote system ID is being used already. So if you remember in the previous step, named search in SMAX for an existing record with remote system ID, we created a field named SMAX ID. So if it doesn't exist, it creates a new one. But if it does, then you need to use the existing one. So I created this condition, current SMAX record, SMAX ID not null, and then this particular set of rules would run. If I scroll down a little, we can see it's using the ID, it's using the description. If we scroll down a little more, we can see the recognizable JSON structure for an update. So notice we have a populated ID field with the SMAX request ID, and we're populating the description field with the data we received from the remote system. It was named remote description. And remember, we need to handle the comments a little different. So if we move down to the next section, we can see I have another condition looking to see if the SMAX ID record is not null. And if it's not null, then we run our comment rule that's going to add our comment. So now we will go back to Postgres and we will make a few changes to our data. So in this case, we're going to add to the description, updates. We can add change to our comment to update a comment, and then we will push send. And we will wait again for our 200, which indicates that the data has been sent correctly. Okay. We're going to go back to our request that we had created, and we can refresh this. Now notice we have our new comment. The update is going to be coming from here. So obviously it found the existing record. It searched and located our 8675309 and it successfully updated the existing record. So that I know that was quite a bit of information we showed, but Jan and I can answer any questions anyone has before we move on to the scheduler method of running the integration. So I paused. Did any questions come in, Verduza?
There is one question. Yeah, there are a few actually. So Jan answered the question about. So question is, what type of authentication is supported on that webhook?
Okay.
And yeah, and the answer is 2 of them, right? So the URL based and then the basic authentication. Anything else to add to that, Jan?
I mean, yeah, I can explain this a little more in detail than if, if you use basic authentication, if you generate a listener in a scenario, you can enter a username and then you click a button which then generates an API token. So instead of password, you must use this API token. You cannot use the user's password any longer to use this data. And then basically you use this credentials username and the API token, but use this API token as password in your remote system where you maybe configure then a webhook which requires basic authentication. The other option is URL-based authentication. That means you simply need to generate this URL. The URL then includes some encrypted data, which basically authenticates then against the listener. And in this case, you only need the URL. You don't need any basic authentication or other methods to basically call the listener, because the URL itself includes all data we need to authenticate.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Can the listener be used to update any fields?
The listener itself, of course not, but the listener, with the listener, right, it's then an endpoint you can use to trigger something in the integration engine. And once the data is received in the integration engine by calling the listener, yes, then you can update basically any field in your SMAX instance by whatever you can update with the EMS API. You can also then update once the call is received in the integration engine.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So Carl, I guess we can go to the next.
All right.
So are there any questions? So I thought the best way to demonstrate the different ways the integration engine can be called is to reuse the same scenario I just showed, but call it a different way. So here we are on the integrations page again. We can see next to it we have this scheduler tab. So we'll click that. We can see here that I've already created a scheduler job that will run our scenario. But just to review how this works, if we wanted to add a new scheduler job, we would just click add. And then we're going to name our job. So, test one. We'll pick our integration. So in our case, remember, we have the Webhook demo integration. And then we pick the scenario. So Postman to SMAX integration. Click next. And then we have to set the start time. So we'll just pick, we need to pick time zone. So I'll just pick Africa. The start date. So we need it to be sort of after our current time. So I'll pick the 7th that it starts on. And we can click next. Now, if we want to pass variables to the integration, this is where we would do it here. So in this case, for example, in our scenario, we know that we need the remote system ID. So we would add the remote system ID, and then we would pass it whatever whatever ID we want. So whatever we want. Anyway, for this fully to work, we would have to add all 4. So we need the remote system title, remote system description, and then the comment. But I'll just cancel this because I have that set up here. So if we were to edit our existing schedule, then let's click next. We can see the time. Again, I got to make it beyond right now. And you can see here where I had pre-populated all of the variables we would need. So in this case, you can see I have remote system ID is 888-777-666. And then I have a few other parameters. Now, because this is calling the same scenario, we know we have two things that could occur. We could have a new request created, or if that value existed already, we would have an update occur. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in this case, you can see I pre-populated the value. So we can go into our requests, and I'd already selected it here. We can open here. We can see our remote system ID is our 888-777-666. And if I scroll down, you can see here, I have all kinds of updates. So I started the scheduler job yesterday and I had it run every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, the only thing that was changing, it was adding a new comment. So you can see, if we look in our history, right, we can see many comment updates. So if I scroll down right to the bottom, so we can see our first step was the integration engine was called. It ran, it created a new request. You can see here. And then you can see all the updates after every 5 minutes. It was just adding a new comment in. So you can see, in this case, the use case maybe isn't a good one. It's creating an internal thing. But if the use case were to fetch records from a remote system once a day, use cases like that, that's where the schedule comes in very handy to use. If I go back into our endpoints, we can see here that when the scheduler calls the integration engine, it's the same thing that occurs. All of the same, oh, we just had an update, but all of the same sections are called. So the first thing it does is it receives the data, and it'll search, and then it'll run either the request creation or update. So, and that, not nearly as complicated as the other one, but that is the scheduler-based calling of the integration engine.
All right. So, any questions on that?
Okay, so I think there's just one question. I guess the typical use case for the scheduler would be to integrate with an external system. Yes, exactly, and then get the latest updates on a regular basis.
Right, and we could schedule push or pull examples in our scenario. So I don't know if Jan wants to expand on that a little.
Yes, that's possible. You can basically schedule all the scenarios, either you pull data from your external system or you push data to your external system. This is all possible to do with the scheduler.
Okay. All right, well, I'll run. So this is the third one here, so I'll run.
So the last integration engine use case we're going to provide is one dealing with current tenancy entity updates. So the idea is that we want to use the integration engine to be able to update other entities within the same tenant. So the use case that we've come up with is where we're going to use one request, and it's going to trigger the integration to update multiple other requests. So this wasn't possible in the past, but now with the new features, we'll be able to do this. And so again, here's a little block diagram. Our demo is going to start in the self-service portal, where we've created an offering that has a task plan with both approvals and rules that will call the integration engine. We will then show the scenario of how the rules work and how it processes the data. We'll show how we could search and find data. And the last part is one of the important parts, is where we're able to create a list of values and store that list in an array, and then iterate through the array on multiple values and update them all at the same time. So if I open the self-service portal and find the offering we've defined, which is named reassign a user's request to a different user. Request. So you can see that this offering is to update all of the user's requests so that a different user becomes the requested for user and can see the user's requests in the portal. So this offering can be used in cases like a user leaving on vacation, or going extended leave, or leaving the company, or switching positions. Anyway, so what we'll do is we can enter our description. So Alec Yellow is leaving the company. So on Alec Yellow, he reports to me as the manager. So I can select Alec Yellow. And then we will hit submit. So in this case, I'm Alec's manager. So I'm going to get an approval to set the request to myself. But if it was done by another user, then the approval would always go to the manager of the person that is having the records moved. So if I go up here to my to-do queue, I can see all of a sudden we have a request that's appeared, reassign a user's request to a different user. So I'm just going to go ahead and approve it. Add a little comment. I approve. And we will click submit. Okay. So if we go to the request grid now, so we can see in here I had the request that Alec owned already in the grid. But if I hit the refresh button now, so our job is running. So we should start to see, yes, we can see the requested for users are all changing to my user, Carl Van. So one more thing to add. So in the past, to be able to do this kind of operation, you'd have to open a ticket and then the agent would manually have to do a bulk update. Well, now we have the advantage of the integrations engine to be able to do all of that in an automated way. So now I'll get into a little of the details of how we were able to use or to create this use case. So we're going to go to our catalog and to our offerings. And you can see here, here's the offering that we had created about reassigning a user's request. We recognize the description and everything. If we click on the task plan, we can see a couple things. So number one, under approve, you can see the approval I created. So in this case, it was just the manager of the user. And then the other one you can see is I have a fulfill task. So if I click on the task, we can edit it. So this is where we are able to call an integration scenario from within a business rule. So you can see here, calls integration engine using integration person record updates and run scenario update employees request. So now we can move over to our integration engine. Oops. And we can see here, I'm in the person record updates, update employee requests. If I scroll down, I am not using a listener in this case, so we don't see any listener. And then if we look in our process logic, we can see all of the various sections that I've added. So we can see our first section, get a request ID and assign it to the initial request ID. So this is where the information is passed from the request to the integration engine, and we assign it to a variable. As we move down, we can see our next thing we need to do is we need to get the user ID of the user whose requests need to be moved or changed. So you can see I have a number of fields I've populated, including the requested person. If we scroll down, we can see that I parse the output to find the ID values that I require. We'll go down a little farther. So now I need to use that data. So if we click here on our get list of requests to update, in this case, we're going to be returned an array of data. So it's going to run a query. It's going to find all of the request IDs that belong to our Alec Yellow user, and it's going to put them into an array that we can then use and iterate through to run an update on each one of them. We'll go down a little farther. We can see our last step, update each request. So you can see here, executes a block of rules for each item in the input array. So we've created an array of IDs, and now we're going to run an operation on each one of those records. So we can see we have two more sections we've added. So the first one, find the record ID. So in this case, we are looking in the array, we're getting the ID out. And after we find the ID, we're running our second step, which is we are updating the ID with our new requested for user, which in this case is the manager. So if we scroll down a little, we can now see, after all the previous operations, we can see our EMS REST update. And so this is what's going to actually do the update. So what it'll do is it'll go through each of the items in the array until they're all updated. And so that's how they were all able to be moved from Alec Yellow to Carl Van.
All right, that was the third demo. Do we have any questions on that one?
There are no new questions, but let's open up. I'm going to unmute all participants. So you can now come off your individual mute and also ask them live, or still continue typing into the question panel. Give the opportunity to gather your thoughts. So as Carl and Jan mentioned, this is with the new capabilities of listener and scheduler. Obviously there is quite a bit more flexibility in defining integration scenarios. And then the last demo presented by Carl shows how powerful use cases can be built now, because you can go back and trigger REST calls to the same tenant to perform certain operations that before were a lot harder to implement, or even not possible through business rules or other ways of updating the system. Okay, so question: what happens if an update fails for one of the requests in the list? Does the process exit or continue?
Basically, that's configurable. Behind each rule and in the process logic area, there is a settings where you can decide if this particular rule should stop on an error or if it should continue in case a request failed. Yeah, that's up to your requirements then.
Okay, and then we have a question: does all this work for the SaaS environment? I mean, in theory, yeah, it's the integration engine is available in SaaS. It all depends on where the other environment is and what the expectation is to reach it. But in theory,
yeah. So I mean, as a listener, of course, right? On SaaS, the listener is open and accessible.
Yeah.
You can use that to schedule as well. But SaaS, it means if you want to integrate from your SaaS system to maybe another system on premise, of course, that this then depends on the connectivity to
Right.
your remote system, right? We have also on-premise switch support, which can be used. But yeah, this depends how you can connect to a remote system. But in SaaS itself, from remote system to SaaS, all of this, what you've seen today, should work.
Any limits on the quantity of updates on local tenant? How the auditing is handled, tagged for this sort of update?
We have in our BO, so-called BO, right on the suite administration, we have parameters where you can configure thresholds. I think I need to check up the numbers, but the default threshold is 1,000 requests per hour, I think. But you can configure this in your BO to make sure you don't overload one local tenant. In case someone is spamming your system, you can block it then. You have a throttling feature. And from auditing point of view, not sure what the intention behind this question. Basically, we track all our actions right in the endpoint. You can get a list of everything which came in and which went out from integration point of view. But not sure that this answers your second part of the question for auditing.
Maybe it's about the history on the record, maybe. So as Carl showed, right, the history will show the updates, right? So maybe, yeah, okay. So I guess that answers the question for compliance purpose. Okay. With the new version, I believe I heard that a user can configure an API token and use that for API calls instead of using the login API call to get the token first. Could you explain how that would work, or if I misunderstood?
Yeah, that's possible now. We provide a personal access token for users, your individual user, but also for integration users. And those token can be used then instead of password to authenticate against your SMAX tenant. it's documented in which areas you can generate this personal access token. Let me try and find the documentation to maybe share it in the link in the answer here.
Yeah, and I think we covered that topic last time in the user group with the OData presentation. We'll post the update shortly. We had a bit of a delay with the holidays in the US, but yeah, we'll post the recording from 2 weeks ago soon. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. So just to wrap up, obviously, if you're here, you're familiar with our series, but so go check the community page about the next topics. We do post regular updates there. So in 2 weeks from now, just before the holidays, we'll have office hours. So that would be the last session of the year. And then we'll start fresh in the new year with the first session will be on January 11th. So we'll skip the 4th and we'll start on January 11th. And we're working on the schedules for the topics to come in January. So stay tuned for that. Okay, let's see, anything else? Okay, yeah, so just an update, very nice progress. I wish Integration Engine was able when we started our implementation. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yes, indeed, I think that's a good point, but it's here now, so opportunity for any new development for people to start using it. So if there are no other questions, we'll wrap up here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks to wrap up the year with office hours, an opportunity to exchange information, provide feedback. And yeah, with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.